I wanted to one day write a book about the great JASCHA Heifetz, my favourite violinist of all time. But whether that will ever materialise is another matter. I do feel somewhat out of my depth to achieve such a mammoth task, and others are surely better qualified than me to do that. Not least the Maltese father and son who have had an ongoing project, which I believe the son will continue, to publish a book about JASCHA Heifetz. So I thought instead I could make a series of videos about the great maestro, collating together all of the research I have done about this great and wonderful violin player. But in talking about JASCHA Heifetz, I feel it necessary to define the word cognoscenti. A cognoscenti is one who possesses a special knowledge of music. With that special knowledge, one can at times feel both privileged and frustrated. The saying springs to mind, do not throw your pearls before swine. Let's face it, not everyone is going to be able to appreciate the name of JASCHA Heifetz and his music. Many will not be able to tune into that kind of world. Heifetz himself loathed mediocrity completely, and Wexler Vered's book suggests that this was instilled into him by his father Reuben Heifetz. So we could say therefore that everything Heifetz did was in good taste. Would you agree with that? When Heifetz dabbled in folk songs, Brazilian songs, Mac the Knife, jazz, Gershwin, whatever it is that he maybe dabbled in, maybe the romantic song compositions sung by Bing Crosby that Heifetz had composed under the pseudonym of Jim Hoyle, you name it. From that right the way up to the Sibelius Violin Concerto, the pinnacle of Western classical music tradition, we could say, Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, everything Heifetz did from small to great was in good taste. Would you agree? That's how I feel anyway. But back to this subject of cognoscenti, Heifetz was once a household name in America. That is no longer the case today, and it is a sad reflection of how society in general has perhaps slipped away from the classical music tradition, although obviously Heifetz, from what I'm seeing online in social media, is still super well known and respected within the classical world. Outside of that, he is perhaps diminishing over time. So classical music is not as accessible as popular music. Compare how you would feel after a Shostakovich concerto versus maybe a Taylor Swift or a Metallica concert. So the Shostakovich, you would come away feeling tired, it could be said, due to the sheer amount of concentration required. Whereas perhaps the pop or the metal concert, you would come away buzzing and electrified. So it's not as popular. It requires exercising your brain like a muscle in order to be able to access and understand and appreciate classical music. And you could compare it with films. The 2023 Barbie film, which grossed over $1 billion, I believe. I personally struggled to watch that beyond a few minutes, but many people did love it. However, if you mention the Apu trilogy, and in particular Pata Panchali by Satyajit Ray, very few people would have heard of that, and even within India, only very few. In fact, perhaps more people outside of India than inside have heard of that legendary director. The arrogant or cynical person would say most people are stupid. But perhaps it has to do with exposure as well. So here, when we're talking about Heifetz, those of us who are privileged to know of him and appreciate him, we could say with pride that we are in that small cognoscenti group of those who possess a special knowledge of music. A privilege and a frustration. A privilege because there's so few of us and it's a novelty. A frustration because when we try at times to explain these things to others who just don't get it, we fail to convince them of Heifetz's greatness. If we appreciate Heifetz music, then we have something special. It shouldn't go to our heads, we shouldn't become arrogant with it, but we should treasure it like the man who found the small pearl of great value. Appreciation of the highest expression of pure artistry and musicianship imaginable. And in this sense we have something in common with Heifetz, because, as mentioned, he was a man who loathed mediocrity. And in order to appreciate Heifetz, usually by definition, we hate mediocrity too. They say that when the hairs stand up on your arms, you may have a special gift or ability. When you hear music, I mean. So when you hear special music like, for me, the closing bars of the Sibelius Violin Concerto, the climactic finale, makes the hairs on my arms stand up. And if you also experience that at times, then there may be something special about you. So let me start this video therefore by saying congratulations to you for being part of the Cognoscenti. Or at the very least having a curiosity to learn more about Heifetz and having an open mind about him. Now let's get on to the topic of prodigy versus genius when it comes to the world of classical music and in particular violin playing. Child prodigies have been churned out like peas out of a pod. Indeed, some of the great pedagogues like Auer and Flesch were tired of seeing yet another child prodigy because it didn't always result in a great artist later in life. Now, to be a genius, a born genius, you would have to be a prodigy automatically, but two child prodigies stand out to me from the 20th century up to the present day as being geniuses. These are the two standout prodigies that for me are born geniuses. JASCHA Heifetz, obviously, the subject of this video, and also Yehudi Menuhin. What we'd say with regards to Menuhin is, unfortunately, beyond his late teens, maybe early 20s at the latest, Menuhin started to deteriorate from his peak, whereas in the case of Heifetz, he kept the white heat going until he was well into his 70s, and he quit whilst he was still at his prime. Heifetz was intelligent enough to know not to go beyond a certain stage when he would be laying himself down and people would perhaps be feeling sorry for him, like maybe some other violinists have done. So he knew exactly when to quit. So the longevity of Heifetz is what distinguishes him from Menuhin, but in my view both were born geniuses, and I'll explain what I mean by that now. A child prodigy who is also a genius, a born genius, that means that the individual has special DNA, and one could say, our famous violinists have said, that such a genius is born perhaps only once every 100 years or so. Paganini was obviously one. There are others in history as well that you can probably think of. Let me know in the comments if other than Heifetz and Menuhin there are other standout prodigies who are born geniuses. Remember the definition I'm giving of a genius, somebody who was born with something special. So let's elaborate on that a little. So we do not just mean a wunderkind or wunderkind, some of which have fizzled out, or prodigies who have put in superhuman work effort, such as Isaac Stern or Itzhak Perlman, to rise to the very top echelon of players, perhaps to the top 10 or the top 5. So there are violinists who, while not geniuses, are talented prodigies and have put in an incredible amount of hard work as well. They have something special and they've made it to the top that way. So what I mean by genius here is a special, unique sound, pushing the technique to new dazzling heights, and really it is where a child sounds better than the best adult professional musicians of his or her day. So adult musicians who have completed all their musical studies, who are gifted, talented, world famous, along comes a genius and sounds better than them. This is what Fritz Kreisler had in mind when he said, When you'd just heard Heifetz perform to a private audience, we may as well break our fiddles across our knees. When he and his colleagues had heard Heifetz play in a private setting in 1912, he knew that he had just heard something phenomenal that he had never seen before, probably would never see since then. This is actually a fascinating event that took place at the house of Arthur Abel, who had invited the 11-year-old Heifetz to dinner after his debut with the Berlin Philharmonic. So at this time, Heifetz hadn't completed his studies with Auer. He was still in the Auer class, still for a number of years, but he was already concertizing and dazzling audiences. So with the Berlin Philharmonic, he played the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, and Abel had gathered as many violinists to this dinner as he could, including Kreisler, who accompanied Heifetz on piano when he performed to the private audience, as well as Bronislaw Huberman and Karl Flesch. So quite a star-studded evening, but young Heifetz didn't really succumb to any kind of pressure or nerves. In Heifertz's case, you can get a glimpse of this genius when you listen to the early recording of his Moto Perpetuo. If you can get past the scratchy sound of the old 78 RPM, this is a piece that not many artists perform live, because although it's probably only about a grade 6 piece, to play this Paganini's perpetual motion from beginning to end takes some nerve of steel to do on the concert stage. So we don't hear this very often as an encore. I don't believe. Let me know if you have. But Heifetz's playing is both fast but also ultra clean at speed. That's very difficult to achieve. Breakneck speed, and also you can sense the climax at the end. Without wishing to sound crude, some might use the term orgasmic. The climax at the end of the piece. So listen to that early piece of Moto Perpetuo played by Heifetz, and you will get a sense of what I mean by born genius. Speed, clean, unique sound, way above anything that any version before, except maybe Paganini, but we don't know exactly what he sounded like. And in my opinion, no version of the Moto Perpetuo since has sounded that good, despite the fact that it's a very early recording. So first let's listen to a few opening bars of the Moto Perpetuo, the beginning of the piece by Heifetz. And now let's fast forward to the end, the climax. It is a 4-minute performance. Let's listen to the climactic end that Heifetz gives to the Moto Perpetuo. With regards to Menuhin, people spoke about the child Menuhin as having an ethereal sound as if an angel from heaven were playing. So, beyond the emotion of just a child, something instinctual was awe-inspiring, as if, as they said, like an angel had come down from heaven to play the violin. So Menuhin had this. Menuhin was a born genius, many people would say, through his ethereal sound. As we said, sadly, he couldn't maintain the level of technique that Heifetz could throughout his life. So by that logic, Heifetz is the greater of the two players, in my view. Many will disagree with me on that, which is fine, but that's my view. If you look at the complete life of the player and career of the player, had Leopold Auer himself not said that he couldn't really teach Heifetz much, as Heifetz was a student of God? See my video on when Heifetz was messing about in the Auer class with a ball And what happened on that day, as was related by Isolde Menges, I've made a video on the topic. We can capture as well some salient words by Henry Roth in his book Violin Virtuosos, From Paganini to the 21st Century. I always like to quote what Roth says, especially on Heifetz, because he's a massive fan. Why is it that so many of his eminent colleagues and a veritable legion of violinists the world over freely admit that Heifetz is the greatest among them? Oistrakh once said, "There are violinists, and then there is Heifetz." Stern has said, "When the history of violin playing in our time is written, it will be known as the Heifetz era." From Perlman, Heifetz is the greatest violinist who ever lived. Schering always referred to Heifetz as the emperor. Zuckerman has stated, "I consider Heifetz the king of virtuosos." Kogan revered Heifetz, and his playing and violinistic priorities were greatly influenced by Heifetz. For practically 3 generations, the expression "to play like a Heifetz" has been used to represent the closest thing to perfection in violin playing. Each of those star violinists, each with the powerful ego and massive self-confidence it takes to be a world-class violinist, had the artistic humility to admit Heifetz's supremacy. Indeed, Isolde Menges, a fellow student in the class who was a little older than Heifetz, but in the same Leopold Auer class in St Petersburg in Tsarist Russia, once said that everybody in the class knew that Heifetz was next level above them all. And I know that because Menges related that experience to my violin teacher, who was her student. As Itzhak Perlman once pointed out, every generation produces a handful of truly exceptional players, but a violinist of Heifetz caliber emerges probably only once in a century. I'm quoting Itzhak Perlman's words from the Strad magazine. We could cite many things, like I mentioned, crisp, clean playing at phenomenal speed, but also Heifetz vibrato and his glissando. He revolutionised sliding from the old style, slightly corny styling, to a modern style of glissando that Heifetz ushered in. Roth goes on to say that rumours had already begun to circulate about a young boy in Russia who threatened to dwarf all competitors. Let's talk a little bit about what it was like for Jews living in Tsarist Russia pre-1917, pre-Bolshevik Revolution Russia. They lived in the Jewish enclave, so they were segregated into a large kind of ghetto area that crossed the borders of several countries that were then within the Russian Empire. And many times in history, in Russia and Eastern Europe, the Jews had been scapegoated and persecuted and even massacred in senseless pogroms. Heifetz's friend and musical colleague Gregor Piatigorsky even witnessed a pogrom firsthand. Let's just relate from his biography how he described that pogrom. Piatigorsky, to quote the New York Times, was to the cello what Heifetz was to the violin and Horowitz to the piano. And just a little word of warning, it's quite graphic. Piatigorsky, the great Jewish cellist who was a personal friend of Heifetz and later collaborated with Heifetz and Rubinstein as cellist in the $1 Million Trio, as well as after that with Heifetz in other chamber works, was caught in the middle of a pogrom sometime before the age of 14 in Russia. And he describes it as follows after emerging terrified from hiding in his cellar. When we emerged, our house was a shambles. Only the piano stood in its place untouched. I ran into the yard. People stood in a wide circle. No one spoke. Uncle Gregory wiped tears from his face. "Go away, you should not see," he said. "They slashed open her stomach. She was pregnant." sobbed someone quietly. Rosie was raped. Sam is dead. They hanged the teacher right there. See the fire? A woman pointed at the street. The blood was everywhere. I reached down to touch it. It was still warm. Some people were stained with it, but none looks like a murderer. That night, we all slept close together on the floor. In the morning, a policeman entered the house. Just going to piss, he said, passing through the room. It's a nice place for you people, he remarked, buttoning his trousers on the way out. But when there weren't pogroms happening, the everyday life of Jewish people in the enclave was tough. And this is why their mothers, their fathers pushed young gifted classical musicians to succeed. They pushed their children hard to succeed. Much as, although for different reasons, Asians in the Far East today push their children to succeed in classical music. But for the Jews, it was a means of emancipation, a way by which their children could break free of the bondage. They could leave the enclave and go around the world, ultimately. Succeeding in music was something that the Jews were very good at. And why the violin? Well, it was something that, when fleeing a pogrom, was relatively easy to grab the case and run away with, as opposed to, say, a Steinway piano. Milstein, Heifetz, Seidel, Rubinstein, Horowitz, Piatigorsky, Sasha Lasserson, Elman, even Maxim Vengerov, David Oistrakh, Leonid Kogan, all of these examples of Jews from Russia who were amazing classical musicians. Milstein once said that Jewish players having a gift in classical music was just a coincidence, just a matter of upbringing. I tend to agree. I think that the Jewish history and heritage does have a bearing on the playing, much like the plantations in the southern United States ultimately gave birth to the blues and then to jazz. The Jews had lived in Russia for perhaps 1500 years. The Pale of Settlement came about from 1791 and lasted until 1917. Jews were herded into that area to live. Jews could not remain in the city of St Petersburg after sunset unless they had special exemption, as we will see. Heifetz and his father Reuven would get that in order to study under Leopold Auer, who himself was Jewish and had special privileges because of his position at the Conservatoire. Even some cities within the Pale of Settlement were off limits to Jews. The Pale of Settlement included all of day Belarus and Moldova and extended to Lithuania, Ukraine and East Central Poland, Latvia and Western Russia up to the border with Austria-Hungary. Jewish residents could be extremely poor and life was harsh. The advancing German army in World War I would bring a permanent end to the Pale of Settlement. But Heifetz had been born 16 years earlier in Vilnius, Lithuania. Whether or not, had the Bolshevik Revolution not happened, would Heifetz and all these students from the Auer class have left Russia is questionable, because life was pretty good under the Tsar for those who had special talent in music. It really is the Bolshevik Revolution, and Heifetz actually witnessed the horrors as a teenager from his window, that made these guys leave and go to the West. So Heifetz was born firmly inside the Jewish Pale of Settlement in the northwestern sector. Vilnius was firmly inside the northwestern sector of the Jewish Pale of Settlement. The ultimate pogrom, of course, would happen in Vilnius after Heifetz was safely in the United States and fully grown, established, famous musician by that time. If we look at the Vilnius Jewish population in 1792, it was 250,000. In 1939, 263,000. And tragically, by 1959, it was 24,683. The Jewish population was almost wiped out completely by the Nazi Einsatzgruppen in 1941. Okay, so we've set the scene somewhat for the environment in which Heifetz was born. Joseph Ruvinovich Heifetz was born on the 2nd of February 1901, shared the same birthday as Fritz Kreisler, as it happens. Some say Heifetz may have been born a year earlier, in fact, in 1900. His father Reuven was a concert master of the Vilna Symphony Orchestra, a noble profession for him to have, and as such he could provide a reasonably comfortable living for his wife Anna and his young family. Vilna in Lithuania had a thriving Jewish population. Indeed, the Jewish community made up almost 50% of the city. For his 3rd birthday, Reuven bought him a quarter-sized violin and began to give his young son lessons. JASCHA was never allowed to practice on his own. He was always supervised by his father. Reuven also believed that it was poor showmanship to show facial expressions or excessive movement when playing, so this was instilled into Heifetz from a very early age by his father. He felt that only the violin and the music should convey the emotions. I'd like to quote from this book from Arthur Wexler-Vered, Heifetz biography, an early chapter that speaks about how we could really identify that Heifetz was a born genius based on reports, and born geniuses as opposed to prodigies are super rare, by the way. Since a very early age, JASCHA had maintained a special sensibility to sounds and to music. When he was as young as 8 months old, his face would shine with joy when his father would play a beautiful tune on the violin. But when he heard the slightest note of dissonance, his little face would be distorted as if in real pain. Perfect pitch, perfect intonation. After a short period of time, his reactions to sounds were so distinct that his father indulgently bought him a miniature quarter-sized violin for his 3rd birthday. The boy was most attentive while watching me playing, according to his father Reuven. When he was about 3 years old, he urged me to give him a similar instrument. He repeated his request for some time until I gave it to him. I then played some notes on my violin, which JASCHA managed to reproduce accurately on his tiny one. I played some more, and again he was able to repeat the notes. Moreover, if I played a false note, the boy would immediately start to scream and raise hell. I was astonished. Averse to dissonance. And I had heard that by age 4, Heifetz could already play a Dante etude. If that is true, then that really is amazing and unbelievable. Let's look at a timeline of JASCHA Heifetz's childhood. 1901, Joseph Reuvenovich Heifetz, or otherwise known as JASCHA Heifetz, is born on the 2nd of February in Vilnius, Lithuania. Some say he could have been born in 1899, some say 1900. In 1904 he begins his first lessons aged 3 with his father Reuven. In 1905, apparently Heifetz was already capable of playing a Dante etude aged 4. In 1905, Heifetz's early teacher is Elias Malkin, so he progresses from his father to Elias Malkin. 1906, he gives a performance at the Imperial School of Music in Vilnius, performing the Fantasie Pastorale by Singele. In 1908, Heifetz gives his first performance in Kovno, Lithuania, playing the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. From then on, he became the family's breadwinner. In 1910, Heifetz joins the St Petersburg Conservatoire to study under Ovanes Nalbadian. In 1911, Heifetz begins studies under Leopold Auer at the Conservatoire. In 1911, Heifetz studies under Leopold Auer at the Conservatoire. In 1911 again, he performs at an outdoor concert in St Petersburg before 25,000 people. In 1912, he meets Fritz Kreisler for the first time in Berlin. This is the occasion where Kreisler said to all present, "We may as well break our fiddles across our knees," after hearing Heifetz play to a private audience. In 1912, JASCHA Heifetz appears for the first time in the Strad magazine, October 1912. This legendary artist was first mentioned in the Strad at the age of 11, following several well-received performances. In 1914, Heifetz gives a performance with Arthur Nikisch and the Berlin Philharmonic in Berlin. Then in 1917, Heifetz reaches New York, and in October 1917, Heifetz performs at Carnegie Hall. Our next video will continue the story from the Carnegie Hall performance onward. Let's go through Heifetz's teachers. So Reuven Heifetz, JASCHA Heifetz's father, was his very first teacher from the age of 3. He then went to Ilya Malkin in Vilnius for lessons. After 2 years' study with his father, it was decided that young JASCHA needed to move to another teacher, and so he began lessons with Ilya Malkin, a former pupil of the great Hungarian teacher Leopold Auer. In 1907, Malkin persuaded his former teacher to listen to his young pupil, even though Auer begged not to hear him, saying, "I've had enough of these little geniuses. Please spare me." 6-year-old JASCHA played him the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto and Paganini's 24th Caprice. Can you imagine? 6 years old. Auer was stunned. When he finally spoke, he asked Reuven to bring the boy to St Petersburg to study with him. So then the family moved to St Petersburg, and Heifetz began lessons with Ovanes Nalbadian, Auer's assistant, before progressing to Leopold Auer's class. Leopold Auer helped Heifetz make the difficult transition between child prodigy and teenage artist. Now, we've mentioned a little bit about the Jewish enclave, the pogroms, the anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire, and the persecution of the Jews. And so this was the climate in which Heifetz was to arrive at St Petersburg, where no Jew was allowed to remain within the city gates after dark. Exceptions were made for outstanding musical talents. But in order to support his son, Reuven Heifetz himself had to enroll in the school in Leopold Auer's class. Whether or not he actually took any lessons from Auer, I don't know. But I do know that Heifetz and his father were both enrolled, and that enabled them to stay within the gates of the city after dark. This was a big move for the family, as it meant uprooting the entire family, and although it took a long time to make up his mind, the ambitious Reuven knew that it was the right decision. So in 1910, JASCHA went to study with the great master himself at the St Petersburg Conservatoire, and the year after made his official debut in April 1911. Auer was a demanding teacher, but had a human and kind approach to his pupils. His years of experience and empathetic nature meant that he got the best from each pupil, using a mixture of discipline, understanding, and often humour. For instance, if a pupil was playing badly, he would comment, "I suppose you've just had your bow rehaired," or "These new strings are very trying, aren't they?" To get his message across. Heifetz said of his teacher, what was very important was that the more interest and ability the pupil showed, the more the professor gave of himself. He was a very great teacher. Indeed, Heifetz was very fond of Leopold Auer, and later would speak fondly of him to his own students in America. Heifetz's teacher, Leopold Auer, encouraged his pupils to make their violins sing. Heifetz would spend over 6 years in the Auer class. He arrived around 1910, 1911, or 1910 at the Conservatoire, 1911 in Auer's class, and departed in 1917 with the tumultuous events of the Bolshevik Revolution. Auer did very little work on technique, but since Heifetz could already play virtually anything at sight, this was never a problem. Musically speaking, Auer was a facilitator who built upon each individual's unique personality and expressive instincts. I'm quoting there from the Strad magazine. Heifetz said of him, "Auer was a wonderful and incomparable teacher. I do not believe that there is any teacher in the world who could possibly approach him. Don't ask me how he did it, for I would not know how to tell you, for he is completely different with each student." Again, quoting from the Strad magazine. So Heifetz begins to live a rather charmed life in St Petersburg, and during this time gives many concerts. I'll show you the link to the full list of concerts in the description box. I was astounded to see how much concertizing experience Heifetz already had gained in Russia and Europe before he even arrived to New York in 1917. And I just want to go through some other students in the Auer class. Please see my video on this topic where I go through what happened to each student. But there's quite a list. Eddie Brown, Misha Elman, Nathan Milstein, Tosha Seidel, Isolde Menges, Max Rose and Thelma Given, F. Steinway, Kathleen Parlow, Ephraim Zimbalist, Sasha Lasserson, Cecilia Hansen, Konstanty Gorski, Georges Boulanger, Lyubov Streicher, Benna Rabinov, Julia Klumpke, Sylvia Lentz, Kemp Stillings, Oskar Shumsky, Margarita Mandelstam, Miron Polyakin, Ruth Ray, Michelle Piastro, Francis Macmillan, Joseph Akron, Joseph Borisov, Raphael Bronstein, Samuel Dushkin, Ilya Malkin, Heifetz teacher, that was earlier, Ioannis Nalbadian, that was earlier, also Heifetz teacher, Auer's assistant, George Pellman, Misha Weisbord, Abraham Yampolsky, Philip Yampolsky, Emmanuel Zetlin. Now, of this list, I've got obviously some of them studied with Auer in America after the time in St Petersburg, but many of those that I've just mentioned were with Heifetz in the class. Not least Isolde Menges, and I've done a video about a story Isolde Menges related to my violin teacher Ronda Lima, and they all recognised the greatness, superiority of Heifetz within the class. See my video on the Leopold Auer class and what happened to those students. I've also done a little bit of research into Heifetz musical family tree. What that I mean by that is looking at Heifetz teacher's teacher, and going up through the chain. And it's very interesting. We have Reuven Heifetz, whose teacher I'm not too sure of. Then we have Malkin, Ovanis, Nalbadian and Auer. Auer had as teachers Jakob Dont and Joseph Joachim. Joachim had as teachers Stanislav Servachinsky, whose teacher was his father, and down the Jakob Dont line we have Georg Helmersberger Sr., Joseph Böhm, Pierre Rode, starting to get to some famous names, Giovanni Battista Viotti, Antonio Siloniat, Gaetano Pugnani, Giovanni Battista Somis, and ultimately that leads us up to Arcangelo Corelli, the father of modern violin playing. So musically speaking, Heifetz was a descendant of Corelli via Pugnani, Viotti, Rode, Böhm, Dont, Joachim, Auer, and that is quite an interesting lineage, I thought. By the time JASCHA was a teenager in 1917 Russia, it was becoming unsafe. Russia was becoming unsafe. The country was starting to spiral out of control. Jews were persecuted, yet again, and as everyday life deteriorated, Reuven began to think urgently about moving his family out of harm's way. America was the obvious choice, and so in 1917, the Heifetz family sailed into San Francisco to begin a new life. JASCHA was already known by his reputation in his adopted country, and everyone was eager to hear this prodigy and see if the rumours of a wunderkind were true. So let's just check out the timeline of JASCHA Heifetz's journey to America. The year 1917 arrived with terrible scenes in the streets. Heifetz did not want to be one of the children of the Soviet Revolution. Auer had good musical connections in the USA and so set things in motion for JASCHA to be engaged to perform in 50 concerts with a fee totalling $25,000, a considerable sum at that time in 1917. There were some travel complications in order to attain the goal of reaching the USA. Crossing Europe was just simply not possible with World War I raging. So the route chosen ultimately was through Siberia to Japan and to the USA by ship. So on June the 17th, 1917, Heifetz leaves Russia via the Trans-Siberian Express with his family for the USA, via the Far East, Japan and Honolulu, arriving in San Francisco and then New York. What an epic train journey. Can you imagine making that journey then? With the Bolshevik Revolution happening, kind of leaving that, hoping that nothing's going to go wrong, hoping that you're going to get to your destination. The October Revolution and the ensuing currency devaluation causes almost overnight Reuben Heifetz's fortune or savings to vanish. Heifetz then took the boat to Hawaii and San Francisco. The ship arrived into San Francisco in the autumn of 2017, and from there he travelled across America with his family by train to New York. Heifetz gave a concert in Japan en route to America. His name had gone before him. The USA was eagerly anticipating Heifetz's arrival, and Heifetz would eventually become a US citizen in 1925. In the next video, we'll begin with that legendary performance in 1917 at Carnegie Hall, New York.